Welcome back. A recent study from the CDC found an increase of sexual violence towards teenage girls. The report reveals that in 2019, an estimated 850,000 high school girls reported that they'd been raped. And by 2021, that estimate soared to more than 1 million. Executive Director for the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault, Emily Miles, joins me to discuss the finding. Emily, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Now, as we know, sadly, women and girls have endured a disproportionate number of sexual assault for decades. This isn't necessarily like new information, but could you just expand on this knowledge that we kind of already have?
Absolutely. So we know based on public health data that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 26 men report an attempted or completed sexual assault in their lifetime. So that's data we already knew. The recently released data from the CDC is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is conducted every 2 years for students in grades 6 through 12. So these are children that are responding to these questions. And what the results found was that 1 in 5 teenage girls report that they've experienced sexual violence in the last year. 14% of teenage girls report being physically forced to have sex. And these numbers were really jarring to the public because when we think about this data overall, we tend to think of adults. But what we actually know about the data is that those first numbers I told you, that 1 in 4 and 1 in 26 folks that identify as survivors of sexual violence in their lifetime, over 80% of those experienced their first instance of sexual violence before the age of 25, over 50% before the age of 18. So this is information we've known, but it shines a light on it in a way that we honestly haven't. And the public really tends to think that we're making progress with these numbers, but what this data shows is actually we're moving in the wrong direction.
Now, these are recent numbers. As you mentioned, they do it every 2 years. How has the pandemic increased this vulnerability?
Yeah, this survey is actually 2021 numbers that are being released now. And so when people think about what was happening in 2021, we think about children that were largely not in schools because this was during the pandemic. So these teenagers, these children were home, and we tend to think of that as a safe space. But we actually know because of the data that most cases of sexual violence actually occur with an acquaintance, a friend, a neighbor, or a family member. And so, as these children and teens were home and in these close pods of people, they actually tended to be around people that were more likely to be perpetrators. Also, because they were home, they were disconnected from trusted people like friends and teachers and counselors. So, if violence was escalating, they couldn't reach out to their social support in time to get assistance.
Now, as you mentioned, that we aren't making the progress that we need to, this was something that the CDC's chief medical officer, Dr. Deborah Oury, also said. Why do you think, despite having all of this knowledge, and this is something that we know, why do you think it's a challenge for our society to move forward?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex question. And because of that, there's not just one answer for it. There's a couple of things. One, we as a society don't tend to talk about sexual violence. We see sexual relationships on TV, we see violence on TV, but when it actually comes to talking to children and youth about the realities of violence, we tend to shy away from the conversation. There's a high level of stigma around it. And because of that, we just don't talk about it. We don't teach children and teens about what the realities are. That's one thing. I think we also can't underestimate the impact that children and teens living in a more virtual space has. So when I was younger, you could go to school, you might be bullied, you might be harassed, you might have an instance of violence, but you could go home and you could disconnect. Your home could be a safe space. But because of the way of the world now, teens and children are connected to their social systems in largely virtual spaces. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem comes is that when harassment occurs, when violence occurs, there's no way for them to then step out of that. There's no safe space, there's no respite. And the other thing that the data showed was that very high rates of depression and suicidality, especially among young girls. And a lot of that is because of this inability to disconnect and find safety.
Now, speaking of disconnecting, there has been a rise in online male figures who encourage violent behavior and ideologies toward women and girls. Do you think this could be impacting this finding that we're seeing?
Absolutely. It's not new that you have people with these types of voices and espousing these types of beliefs. This has gone on since the beginning of time. The difference, again, is now there's an online platform that allows these views to spread and, what I think most dangerously, become normalized. So, the first time we sometimes hear some of this hate speech, to be quite honest, we kind of are taken aback and we might gasp, but then we hear it again and again and again. And every time we hear it, it becomes a little bit more normal to hear it. And so then you have that translated to young girls who are hearing this type of language and internalizing it, are young men who are hearing this type of language and internalizing it. And there's no counter voice for it because, again, we're not having these conversations as a society. And so, yes, I think that this changes our social norms as a society and doesn't allow the pushback of like, what actually is normal?
Right. Now, you also mentioned that this is considered hate speech, which I think a lot of people don't view it that way. Why do you think that, people see this stuff online and sometimes you try to report it, but nothing gets done, and a lot of these people just get a chance to, grow on these platforms. Why isn't it viewed as hate speech, do you think?
You know, Obviously, there is always going to be a conflict between our rights of free speech and how far that goes. For me, I think the line is when you start causing harm to someone else. And so it's one thing to espouse a belief, but when that belief then is used to harm someone else, there should be some level of oversight. And unfortunately, our current social media platforms lack that type of oversight. We've seen that recently with Twitter, with them pulling back a lot of the oversight there and the rise of hate speech that has happened. And so I think it's a lack of oversight and honestly, a lack of our comfort as a society to understand where do we draw that line.
Now, is this a form of cyber sexual violence?
I would label it as such. And I'll also say that, and this wasn't as specifically covered in the data, but separate data shows that over the pandemic, we saw huge increases of rates of cybersexual violence because, again, people were home, they're engaging in a virtual space. So we have heard stories of children as young as 9 years old receiving explicit images online. Teenagers, again, who are continuously harassed, receiving unsolicited images. These instances have just continued to increase, and this lack of oversight has really made it more difficult.
Now, I want to bring up something because I know that a lot of people, especially a lot of teens, we watch certain types of shows that may have like negative portrayals of just sexual behavior. And it's not considered a good thing, but it's kind of framed as something that's a positive. I don't want to say any shows, but there are some that are out there. How do you think that contributes as well?
Again, I think it's a normalization. And some of those shows, I think I know the one you're talking about, do reflect common themes that teens and youth are dealing with. That itself isn't a problem. I think the problem is then how do we then address those? Because we're not talking about healthy relationships. We're not talking about healthy sexual relationships. Instead, we're seeing the negative side. We're not seeing the positive side as well. Or we're not seeing necessarily youth being given the tools to then correct some of the negative stereotypes that exist. So again, it's all about balance. Those shows aren't bad. I enjoy them as well. It's really though like understanding that that's fiction. It's entertainment.
Now, unfortunately, in regard to reports about sexual assault, there are often underestimates because people fear speaking out. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, there is a deep level of stigma when it comes to sexual violence in our society. So, when you think about it with youth specifically, you're talking about someone who's at an age in life where their friends and their peer cohort are the most important thing to them. So, then if you are a survivor of sexual violence and you come forward, the thing you fear the most is being separated from that support group, your family, your friends, your peers, being ostracized, being called names, and for that harassment and violence to increase. And unfortunately, when you look at public cases of survivors coming forward, look at the dialogue about how we talk about survivors. We always ask questions about what someone's wearing,
Right.
where they were they drinking?
Like victim blaming, pretty much, right?
Exactly. Instead of then focusing on the perpetrator, the person who actually caused the act of violence.
Now, what does the role of sexual education play in this finding?
It's absolutely huge. When we talk about sex ed, the first thing people think about is talking about people's body parts or talking about birth control. But the truth is, that's just a small portion of what a comprehensive sex ed curriculum entails. We're talking about what is a healthy relationship? How do you set boundaries for yourself? How do you negotiate saying no to something you're not comfortable with? And also important, how do you hear no and be okay with that?
Right.
That's all part of comprehensive sex ed. But unfortunately, in New York State, we actually have no requirement for comprehensive sex ed as a state. And in New York City, even though that is a required part of curriculum, there's no requirement for what that curriculum needs to entail. So the level of quality varies from school to school.
Now, at what age do you think children should be taught about sexual violence and consent? And I know this could be very controversial,
Yeah.
but I want to hear your thoughts.
So bear with me for a second. We need to start when children are very young. I have a 4-year-old, and I am already having conversations with my 4-year-old that will set the stage for these deeper conversations as she gets older. Now, I am not talking about sex with my 4-year-old. What I'm talking about is how to be a good friend. How do we share our toys? How do you create boundaries for yourself with your body? So, when we're leaving a social situation, if my 4-year-old doesn't want to hug someone goodbye, I don't force her to hug someone goodbye. Something within her body is telling her she doesn't feel comfortable. But we as a society tend to then say to those little kids, just do it anyway. Hug your aunt goodbye, hug your neighbor goodbye. And what we're telling them is, override that feeling of discomfort and do something to make someone else happy. So we need to start when children are little, allowing them to feel powerful and being able to say, no, I don't want to do that. Something inside me is saying it's not okay and I don't want to. And the building blocks of that then allow someone to grow up with a confidence to be able to negotiate boundaries. We don't start math with kindergartners and teach them calculus. We teach them to identify numbers, we teach them to count, and then we build in an age appropriate way. And then when they're teenagers or older, in my case, we start learning complex math skills. This is the same thing when we talk about comprehensive sex education. We talk about consent, we talk about being a good friend, so that when you're a teenager, you then know how to set boundaries and you know how to receive boundaries from others.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really insightful. And, I really appreciate a lot of what you said. So thank you so much for that. Now, I have one last question really quickly. Can you just tell me, focusing on the perpetrators of sexual violence towards women and girls, what can society do? And by that, I mean, should there be harsher consequences, stricter laws? Can you just talk about that really quickly?
Absolutely. So, we as a society don't have a great track record with the criminal justice system and supporting survivors of sexual violence. I don't think that this is something we can incarcerate our way out of. That hasn't worked with any other issue in this country, and I don't think it works for this one as well. There does need to be accountability. There does need to be the repair of harm. But again, us just having stricter penalties is not actually going to solve this problem. It's a band-aid. What's going to solve this problem is us creating the societal change to think differently about how do we talk about relationships, how do we talk about sex, how do we talk about power, and then from that, change the norms in this country about how we then engage with a survivor of sexual violence. So, yes, there needs to be accountability, but if we're only doing that and not stopping the wave of sexual violence, it's never going to end.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this. I definitely learned a lot.
Thank you so much.
If you would like to know more about the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey, please go to their website, www.cdc.gov. And to keep up with the New York Alliance Against Sexual Assault, follow them on Instagram at NYC Alliance or go to their website at www.svfreenyc.org. We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Open right after this.